We are absolutely swimming in a sea of knowledge today. We're living in arguably the most documented, tracked, and quantified era in all of human history. It's incredible, really. We can tell you the precise molecular structure of the air we breathe, we track our sleep cycles down to the second with wearables, and honestly, there seems to be an app for optimizing just about everything, from our morning routines to our retirement portfolios. And yet, here's the paradox, isn't it? With every brilliant piece of information we consume, with every new how-to guide we download onto our phones, we seem to feel just a little bit more lost, a little more anxious, perhaps less connected to our actual lived experiences. This is what you might call the tyranny of the intellect. Our entire civilization, especially in the modern West, has championed the mind, rationality, and cold, hard efficiency above almost everything else. We've been subtly conditioned, haven't we, to measure our existence not really in terms of profound experiences or genuine feelings, but in tasks completed, in quarterly achievements measured on a spreadsheet, and in this relentless drive for self-optimization. We've started treating ourselves like these perfectly engineered biological machines that just need the right software update to fix the underlying glitches. The result, when you look closely, is a profound, often debilitating disconnect. We are arguably the highest functioning, busiest generation ever recorded. We're capable of handling incredible loads of stress and complexity in our daily lives. And yet, paradoxically, many of us feel miserable deep down, anxious, and profoundly lonely, even when surrounded by people or digital connections. It doesn't quite add up. Your body is the ultimate truth teller. It simply never lies. When you truly learn to listen deeply to the language of your body, your entire life begins to change from the ground up. You begin to feel again, genuinely. And through that deep, honest feeling, you regain the power to choose consciously, rather than reacting automatically based on old patterns. When you are fully present in your body, you often know the answer instantly, without needing complex analysis. When you are connected to that physical reality, you decide from a place of deep integrity. When you are rooted firmly in your body, you are truly, undeniably living.
That's such a critical starting point, and I think it's absolutely essential to understand exactly why we allowed this profound separation between the mind and the body to happen in the first place. Because this epoch of disconnection, as you called it, wasn't some inherent design flaw in being human. It was actually a highly effective, though ultimately quite self-destructive survival strategy that many of us learned very early on. If we trace this split back to our earliest experiences, specifically looking at childhood, when we faced overwhelming emotional or perhaps physical suffering, the body itself became the scene of the crime, so to speak. When a child experiences humiliation, neglect, abandonment, or any form of abuse, even very subtle emotional unavailability, the pain of that experience lives viscerally, undeniably, within the physical self. It's a felt sense. To escape that searing, often unbearable pain, the realm of thoughts, fantasy, analysis, planning, and seeking control becomes the only perceived safe refuge. We consciously, or perhaps more often unconsciously, moved our center of identity up into the intellect as a way to escape the raw physical and emotional sensations of what we were experiencing down below. And once we took that refuge, once the mind became the designated command center, we never truly forgave the body for the suffering it seemed to hold, the suffering it had to carry for us. That original rupture, that initial choice to disconnect, is arguably the deepest wound in the collective human psyche, and it gets reinforced constantly by the rational, often disembodied structures of modern society. The body possessed the original natural intelligence, what we now often call somatic intelligence. This isn't just about basic reflexes. It's that profound, immediate knowing that informs your decisions well before logic even kicks in. It is the intelligence that instinctively knows when it's time to stop a task before burnout, when it's time to sleep, when it's necessary to cry and release tension, when to physically exit a dangerous or subtly toxic conversation, or how to sense a potential threat, that deep, immediate gut feeling, often long before your conscious mind has even formulated the specific risk. This innate intelligence registers authenticity in others, perhaps causing a subtle vibration or sense of openness in your chest, and it registers falsehood or danger, causing an immediate, subtle contraction or closing off. Yet over time, and particularly with the rise of industrial and now digital cultures, we've systematically, almost deliberately, deactivated this innate wisdom. We've been encouraged to trade this profound embodied intelligence for the cold metrics of rationality, optimization, and relentless efficiency. We've become, as you so aptly described, like floating heads. We often drag our bodies behind us like an inconvenient, sometimes heavy trailer, a thing that needs to be maintained, sure-fed, exercised, cleaned, but not something to be truly inhabited, felt, and trusted. We're often so disconnected that we only become consciously aware of our own heart rate and pulse when a smartwatch measures it and presents it as data. Or we only truly feel our muscles when we push them to the point of failure during an intense workout session at the gym. We frequently only acknowledge our deepest physical sensations when they finally erupt as debilitating anxiety, panic attacks, or chronic pain. The mind is perpetually pulling the often reluctant body along, and that persistent rupture between them, that lack of communication and integration, is a fundamental source of our deepest, most chronic forms of pain and unease. Now, what fuels this ongoing rupture? At its core, it's often a profound, innate desire for love and belonging that gets thoroughly corrupted early in life. Every single human being has an innate, biological need to be loved, to be accepted, and to belong securely within a community or family unit. But unfortunately, through various experiences, many of us were taught, whether through subtle emotional neglect, conditional approval, or even direct instruction, that we couldn't simply be loved just for existing in our authentic state. Our mere existence wasn't enough. It had to be justified. We learned we had to perform, we had to be good, be smart, be quiet, be helpful, be high-achieving essentially, meet external conditions in order to receive the attention, approval, and love we craved. This dynamic of conditional love becomes the powerful jet fuel for the mind-body split. It actively pushes us out of our grounded somatic center and up into the head, where we can continuously monitor our environment, analyze expectations, and optimize our performance to try and meet those external standards and secure our sense of belonging. This heavy reliance on external validation for our sense of worth inevitably empowers a corrupted part of our own mind. This internal function takes on the role of an internal critic, or sometimes even an internal abuser, constantly echoing the high demands, criticisms, or perhaps even the abuses we experienced in childhood. It's the voice that relentlessly tells us we're not good enough, not smart enough, not productive enough, not thin enough, not successful enough. This internal judge, ironically, desperately wants to be seen and heard itself. And here lies a profound insight for healing. When we stop fighting this internal voice, when we start trying to argue with it or suppress it, and instead bring conscious, compassionate awareness and honest presence to it, when we simply observe this critical voice without judgment, noticing its tone, its demands, its fear as it begins to lose its absolute power over us. The goal isn't to destroy the mind. The goal is to heal the rupture by changing our relationship to these internal parts. We often perpetuate this disconnected state through a kind of junk food cycle, which extends far beyond just nutrition. We consume information like mental junk food. It's fast, it's easy to digest superficially, it gives us a quick dopamine hit of novelty or outrage, but it's ultimately unfulfilling and doesn't nourish us deeply. And what does our physical body receive in return? Often the same kind of junk treatment. Chronic sleep deprivation, normalized as hustle, rushed eating while distracted or working, zero attention paid to its natural rhythms of rest and activity, and relying on superficial motivation or stimulants like caffeine to drive us past the point of genuine exhaustion. It leads to a tragic paradox. We frequently lament, perhaps internally or externally, that no one truly loves us or understands us. Yet our own physical body loves us unconditionally, every single second of every single day. Our heart beats faithfully without us needing to command it. Our lungs breathe for us, keeping us alive moment to moment. Our immune system fights tirelessly, often silently, for our survival against countless threats. Our body does absolutely everything it can to support us, but often the controlling, judgmental, fear-driven aspect of the mind prevents us from truly loving, accepting, and inhabiting ourselves entirely, from head to toe. The ultimate truth here, the core message, is that the mind is not inherently the enemy, and the body is absolutely not the problem to be fixed or overcome. The real source of our deepest pain is the rupture itself, the separation, the lack of communication and integration between them. Healing, therefore, is the patient, often challenging, restoration of the sacred alliance. And it's achieved not primarily through more analysis or intellectual understanding, but through cultivating presence, through the conscious act of deep diaphragmatic breathing, through courageously allowing ourselves to feel every emotion that arises without judgment, and crucially, through offering ourselves deep, radical self-forgiveness for the ways we learn to survive. That willingness to finally let the body speak its truth and have the mind listen with compassion, that's what truly sets us on the genuine path towards becoming whole again.
That framework, seeing the rupture itself as the core wound, really shifts the perspective, doesn't it? And it leads directly into thinking about how this foundational separation translates into our most visible, common, and often destructive coping strategies, particularly addiction. Because if that mind-body split is the underlying disease, then maybe addiction, in all its forms, is the most desperate symptom. It's the body's loudest, most painful biological cry for integration, for wholeness, for relief from that internal separation. Following this line of thought means we absolutely have to stop viewing addiction primarily as a simple moral failing or just a lack of personal willpower. That perspective is not only unhelpful, it's often deeply inaccurate and harmful. Instead, we can begin to see addiction, perhaps controversially to some, as a profound, sometimes even logical in a distorted way, response to deep-seated, often unbearable emotional pain and overwhelming feelings of isolation or disconnection. If you look at the really insightful work of Johann Hari, who dedicated years to traveling the world and investigating the root causes of addiction, his primary argument resonates perfectly with this idea of disconnection being central. Hari famously and powerfully articulated that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, which tends to focus narrowly on just stopping the substance or behavior, but rather, the opposite of addiction is connection, genuine, meaningful human connection. He observed, through countless interviews and studies, that the conventional wisdom, the idea that addiction is purely a chemical hook within a substance that hijacks the brain, is fundamentally insufficient to explain the phenomenon. While brain chemistry is involved, it's not the whole story, not by a long shot. Hari found compelling evidence suggesting that when individuals lack healthy, supportive human bonds, when they lack a connection to a meaningful community, and when they lack a true sense of purpose in their lives, those essential elements that ground us in our physical and social reality, they will inevitably, perhaps even biologically, form powerful, unhealthy, and compulsive bonds with substances or behaviors as a substitute. Drugs, alcohol, gambling, shopping, even workaholism can become substitutes for that missing connection. This realization radically shifts the entire focus of treatment and recovery. It moves away from merely removing the drug or stopping the compulsive behavior as the primary goal. Instead, the necessary, truly curative work becomes actively helping the individual build a life that is rich with meaning, filled with genuine community support, and characterized by authentic connection to others, connection to meaningful work or purpose, and ultimately connection back to themselves. It reframes the problem not just as a personal brain chemistry issue, but as an environmental, relational, and even spiritual crisis. But let's pause there for a moment, because while that idea that connection is the opposite of addiction is incredibly inspiring and holds a lot of truth, sometimes it can feel a little too simple on its own, can't it? If connection is the cure, why is it often so incredibly difficult, almost impossible sometimes, for a person who has experienced deep trauma to genuinely connect with others, even when a supportive community is readily offered? Why do they keep pushing connection away or sabotaging relationships? That's where the profound analysis of Dr. Gabor Maté becomes absolutely essential to add another layer of understanding. Maté takes the analysis even deeper, compellingly arguing that the core question we absolutely must ask ourselves and ask those struggling is not why the addiction, but rather why the pain. What is the underlying pain that the addiction is trying, however maladaptively, to soothe? He insists, based on decades of clinical experience, especially with severely addicted populations, that addiction is, in fact, often a deeply rational, albeit self-destructive, coping mechanism employed by a wounded psyche desperately trying to soothe itself. And that wound, that unbearable internal pain, is almost invariably rooted in unresolved childhood trauma. And here it's critical that we really emphasize and broaden our understanding of what trauma means in this context. It absolutely includes overt physical or sexual abuse, which are devastating, but it also encompasses the much more common, often invisible, yet equally damaging experiences of subtle emotional neglect, growing up with chronically unpredictable or conditional love, or experiencing a chronic lack of secure, non-judgmental attachment with primary caregivers. These seemingly smaller developmental injuries, these relational deficits, create a perfect internal storm of pain, a kind of internal screaming child that desperately, relentlessly demands to be anesthetized, to be quieted, to be escaped from. The substance, be it alcohol, opioids, cocaine, or the compulsive behavior, whether it's scrolling social media for hours, obsessive gambling, uncontrollable shopping, or even relentless overworking, simply offers the quickest, most immediately available route to temporarily quiet that internal chaos. It functions as an effective, but ultimately catastrophic painkiller. It works in the short term, which is why it becomes so entrenched, but it destroys life in the long term. And underpinning this entire cycle, providing the deep psychological foundation upon which addiction often builds, is the powerful emotion of shame. We simply cannot have a complete discussion about the mechanics of addiction without integrating the groundbreaking, vital work of researcher Brené Brown on shame and vulnerability. Shame, as Brown defines it, is that intensely painful feeling or core belief that you are fundamentally unworthy of love and belonging. It's that deep, pervasive, existential dread that if people really knew the real you, all your flaws, your imperfections, your secret thoughts, or past actions, you'd be utterly rejected, disconnected, and cast out from the human tribe. This feeling of being fundamentally flawed, the belief that I am wrong, or I am bad, not just I did something wrong, is the primary psychological fuel that keeps addictive behaviors burning. We hide our shame, we desperately try to suppress our perceived imperfections, and we numb ourselves with substances or behaviors, all in a frantic attempt to avoid being truly seen as flawed, because being seen as flawed is mistakenly equated in our nervous system with certain exclusion and unbearable aloneness. Brown's ultimate antidote to this corrosive shame is radical vulnerability, which sounds terrifying, but she defines it simply as the courage required to be truly imperfect and to connect authentically with others, sharing your whole, sometimes messy, vulnerable self. She reminds us that the word courage itself comes from the Latin root cor, meaning heart. And true courage, therefore, is to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. We live in a society that constantly pressures us to be strong, to put on a brave face, to present a polished, invincible facade to the world. But the actual strength, the profound power that finally begins to break the addictive cycle, is found in the willingness to show up authentically, cracks and all, and allowing trusted others to witness your imperfection without you running away or them rejecting you. That experience of being seen and accepted in imperfection is profoundly healing. Even the most traditional recovery pathways, such as the widely practiced 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous, recognize the sheer futility of trying to control everything through sheer willpower or intellect alone. A true cornerstone of recovery in these models is the principle of surrender, the foundational idea of letting go of the illusion of control. This is the exact moment when the exhausted, controlling, often perfectionistic mind finally admits defeat. It's the moment of recognizing that you cannot control the universe, you cannot single-handedly change the past, and you cannot white-knuckle your way out of a deeply rooted biological and psychological compulsion. Instead, the path forward involves seeking support from a community, from something larger than oneself, whether that's conceived as a higher power, the group itself, or simply the process of recovery. It's a profound recognition of human limits and the need for interdependence. So when we synthesize all these crucial insights, Hari's focus on the environment and connection, Maté's relentless focus on underlying trauma and pain, and Brown's vital work on shame and vulnerability addiction stops looking like some overwhelming moralistic monster that defines a person. It becomes, instead, a signpost. A painful, destructive signpost, yes, but a signpost nonetheless. It points towards a misguided, desperate attempt at healing, a chemically or behaviorally substituted search for the lost connection, the lost peace, the lost ecstasy of the integrated soul. It's a substitute for the state where mind and body are working together in harmony. The true thirst that drives the compulsion is rarely just for the substance or the behavior itself. The deeper underlying thirst is for a life lived fully, consciously, authentically, and in genuine, meaningful connection with oneself and with others.
Exactly. And that decision you mentioned, the one to admit the mind's absolute limits in controlling the compulsion and to begin the process of surrender, brings us squarely, inevitably, back to the body. And back to the undeniable realization that the body absolutely keeps the score. You spoke earlier about the rupture between mind and body. The body's scorekeeping is the tangible, biological, often measurable consequence of living within that rupture for prolonged periods. The conscious mind, through sheer willpower, focused determination, or perhaps more commonly, through psychological defenses like denial and dissociation, can quite effectively deny, minimize, rationalize, or even completely forget emotional pain. The mind can trick itself, sometimes for decades, into believing the original pain no longer exists or wasn't that significant. But the body operates differently. The body is a meticulous, unbiased biological archive. Every single unexpressed emotion, every swallowed fury from a boundary violation, every hidden shame from a past humiliation, every terrified plea that went unheard, every unspoken betrayal that sits like lead in the stomach, remains archived somewhere within your physical structure. It's held in your muscle tissue, in your fascia, the connective tissue web throughout your body, potentially altering your gut microbiome, and most critically, encoded within the patterns of your nervous system. These potent energies are not gone just because you stop thinking about them. They are merely frozen in time, held in suspension, awaiting some form of biological release or conscious somatic recognition to complete their cycle. And this archived, unprocessed pain does not remain silent forever. Eventually, it learns to speak through what we might call somatic language, the language of physical symptoms. This is a language that the modern medical system, with its focus on specialized parts and biochemical pathways, often fails to fully recognize or interpret in its integrated context. For instance, unprocessed loss, or long-term, unacknowledged grief can literally settle in the body as a persistent physical weight, a feeling of constriction, or a chronic dull ache deep in the chest cavity. An unspoken betrayal, or perhaps years of swallowing back your truth to keep the peace, can manifest as a chronic, tight knot in the throat or the jaw muscles, sometimes making it physically difficult to breathe deeply, to swallow comfortably, or to speak your mind clearly and assertively. Chronic, unexpressed emotions, especially pervasive anxiety, fear, or the constant effort of emotional repression, frequently transform over time into recurrent, often medically unexplained physical symptoms. Think of debilitating migraines that have no clear trigger, relentless muscle tension, leading to conditions like fibromyalgia, chronic irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, where the gut seems perpetually inflamed, and that soul-crushing chronic exhaustion or burnout that sleep alone cannot seem to cure. The body demonstrates incredible patience, often for many years, compensating and adapting around these held tensions. But eventually, if the disconnection persists, it often presents a kind of biological ultimatum. This is captured so powerfully in the therapeutic insight. When you cannot consciously say no, your body will eventually say it for you. Through illness, through pain, through exhaustion. This is the core biological essence of how many modern trauma adaptations play out physically over a lifetime. Consider the child faced with that agonizing, impossible choice. Maintain their authenticity, which might involve expressing legitimate feelings like fury, setting necessary boundaries, or showing vulnerability like powerlessness, or achieve acceptance and maintain connection, which requires suppressing those authentic feelings to ensure survival by gaining love or avoiding rejection and abandonment. The child, out of biological necessity for attachment, almost always chooses acceptance. Survival trumps authenticity every time when you're small and dependent. So the child learns to bury those true, often intense feelings, the rage, the fear, the sadness, in order to maintain the crucial bond of love or perceived safety. But this buried, unexpressed life energy does not simply die or vanish, it transforms. It morphs over time into socially acceptable, sometimes even highly praised, but ultimately self-destructive adult drives. Think of relentless perfectionism, obsessive-compulsive tendencies aimed at hypercontrol, the pattern of unrelenting burnout from overworking, and frequently the development of chronic inflammatory conditions or even autoimmune diseases, where the body's own immune system literally begins to attack itself, mistaking parts of the self as foreign threats. This represents the catastrophic biologic cost of sustained inauthenticity, and we can actually trace the pathology through the nervous system's response. When you consistently repress strong emotions, your body keeps activating the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, HPA, acts as the primary stress response system. Your amygdala, the brain's threat detector, perceives the unexpressed anger, the hidden shame, or the constant underlying fear as a genuine ongoing threat to your safety or belonging. This floods your system chronically with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. When this activation becomes chronic, rather than acute and short-lived as it's designed to be, those stress hormones cease to be protective and become highly corrosive to the body. They suppress the immune system over the long term, making you more vulnerable to infections and illness. They promote chronic, low-grade inflammation throughout the body, which is now understood as a key driver of many modern diseases, including heart disease, diabetes, and even certain cancers. And they physiologically shift blood flow away from the prefrontal cortex, the center of rational thought, planning, and emotional regulation, towards the limbs and the more primitive parts of the brain, keeping you perpetually primed for fight, flight, or freeze responses, even in the absence of immediate external danger. We see this tragic pattern repeated clinically with devastating regularity. The perpetually available person, the one who seems incapable of saying no, who always prioritizes everyone else's needs while quietly crumbling inside, suppressing their own needs and resentment. This pattern is often correlated with the development of certain cancers, diseases where the body's own cells seem to have quite literally lost their essential protective boundaries and replicate uncontrollably. Or consider the high-achieving man who rigidly represses decades of legitimate anger and frustration, maintaining a hyper-calm, overly efficient, and tightly controlled facade. This is the classic personality type, often associated with a sudden massive heart attack, kind of explosive physical expression of all that contained pressurized energy. And the relentless perfectionist, the one who never permits themselves a moment of rest, vulnerability, or perceived failure, frequently ends up totally depleted, chronically ill, physically and emotionally hollowed out on the inside, often wondering how they got there despite doing everything right according to external standards. Now, this point is absolutely critical. This connection between emotional repression and physical illness is not some form of vague, mystical, New Age karma punishing you for bad thoughts. It is simple, observable, verifiable human biology playing out. Every single forced yes that goes against your authentic somatic knowing, your gut feeling, your body's truth acts like a small cumulative drop of corrosive acid internally. It's a sustained microdose of cortisol that slowly, progressively wears down the integrity of your immune system, your vascular system, and your overall resilience. Every important no that is left unsaid, every boundary that isn't defended, becomes like a contained explosion of highly inflammatory energy locked within the muscles, the fascia, the gut lining, contributing to chronic tension, pain, and digestive issues. It is absolutely crucial, however, especially when discussing chronic pain or illness, to reframe these often debilitating physical symptoms. The body is not punishing you for past mistakes or perceived weaknesses. The body is, in its own desperate way, inviting you home, back into connection with yourself. The physical pain is not an enemy that must be attacked, silenced, or eliminated at all costs. It is often a profound, albeit challenging teacher, a messenger from your deeper self who loves you too much, respects your life force too much, to allow you to continue living falsely, disconnected from your core truth indefinitely. Healing, therefore, within this framework is not primarily about finding a magic pharmaceutical bullet or brilliant surgical fix to simply eliminate the symptom, although those can sometimes be necessary supports. The deeper healing journey involves creating the safety and space to allow that pain, that symptom, that exhaustion, to finally tell its full, complete, and honest story. What does it need? What boundary was crossed? What truth was silenced? What part of you needs reclaiming? The true deepest compassion we can cultivate is not necessarily the compassion we practice externally towards others, though that's important too. It's the radical gentleness, the unwavering presence, and the deep listening we finally offer to ourselves, right in the presence of our own pain and limitation. It's that moment we finally realize deep in our bones, I do not have to prove anything anymore. I have permission to stop pushing, to stop fighting myself, to just breathe, and to simply feel what has been frozen, locked away inside me, perhaps for decades. That is the beginning of true somatic healing.
That perspective shift, seeing symptoms not as punishment, but as an invitation from the body, is undeniably powerful. Yet I imagine it's also profoundly challenging for anyone currently living with truly debilitating chronic pain or illness. It's one thing to say, listen to the wisdom of your mild headache, but quite another when the physical symptoms are literally crushing your life, your ability to function, your hope. How do you hold that perspective that the body is inviting you home without inadvertently minimizing the very real, very intense suffering involved?
That is the absolute heart of the matter, the essential tension in this work. And you've pinpointed it perfectly. It highlights precisely why this path of healing must be a process of careful, patient integration, not just detached observation or intellectual reframing. Because as you say, the body often speaks in whispers first. But when we consistently fail to listen to those subtle cues, the fatigue, the tension, the gut feelings, it eventually has to shout. And those shouts can indeed be debilitating pain, crippling anxiety, or profound exhaustion. The invitation then is not necessarily to love the pain itself in some masochistic way, but rather to courageously acknowledge the profound truth that the pain is carrying. What message is embedded within the suffering? We need to start looking closely at what the body is actually doing physiologically as it attempts to manage its internal state of overwhelm or disconnection. For instance, chronic fatigue isn't simply a lack of adequate rest. It's often the entire nervous system hitting the brakes, biologically demanding that you stop the current pace or situation because the required level of performance, stress, or perhaps inauthenticity is becoming biologically lethal to your system. So the invitation in that case is to actually honor the exhaustion. Truly listen to it, rather than just fighting it with more caffeine, more willpower, more pushing through. We begin to shift the core question we ask ourselves. Instead of asking, how do I fix this symptom? How do I get rid of this pain? We start asking, what fundamental life boundary has been consistently violated here? What core value is being ignored? What part of my authentic self has been exiled or suppressed for so long that the body is now having to defend it through this extreme measure of pain or shutdown? This recognition, this shift in inquiry, even if it doesn't instantly alleviate the physical discomfort, and often it doesn't, this is a process that allows the internal fighting to cease. You stop seeing your own body as the enemy, as the betrayer, as the source of the problem. Instead, you start, perhaps tentatively at first, to see it as a profoundly loyal ally, desperately trying, in the only way it knows how, to save your life, to bring you back into alignment with your own truth before it's too late. It's about changing the relationship first, which then creates the conditions for physical shifts to occur over time.
I really appreciate that clarification, that focus on the relationship with the body and the meaning behind the symptom, rather than just the simplistic, listen to your pain message. It moves us firmly into the practical realm of what psychologists now often call emotional agility. This concept speaks to the capacity to feel absolutely everything that arises within you: the intense fear, the burning rage, the profound sadness, the deep shame, without automatically identifying with any of it. The core idea is you are not the emotion itself. You are the consciousness, the space, the awareness experiencing that emotion as it moves through you. When you can learn to say, I feel fear arising within me, instead of just I am afraid, you create a sacred, necessary space between your core identity and the immediate, often overwhelming physical sensation and thought patterns associated with that emotion. Let's start with fear, because in our culture, we are so heavily conditioned to view fear as the ultimate enemy, the direct antithesis of confidence, courage, and success. We're taught to overcome it, suppress it, push past it. But from a biological and even spiritual perspective, fear isn't inherently bad. It's actually your most reliable, most ancient biological radar system. It represents biological intelligence, psychological awareness, and even spiritual guidance, all wrapped into one potent signal. Without the capacity to feel fear, you literally cannot know courage. Because true courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to take necessary action in the presence of fear. We really have to understand the spectrum of fear to work with it effectively. On one extreme end, you have that paralyzing chronic anxiety, the kind that makes you constantly evade life's challenges, postpone every difficult but necessary decision, and gradually shrink your world down into a tiny, seemingly manageable, but ultimately airless and unfulfilling bubble. That's fear operating in its maladaptive controlling mode. But on the other side of the spectrum, there exists healthy fear, the kind that actually gives you a sharp, heightened focus, a surge of available energy, and clear feedback about potential risks. This kind of fear is your guide, your ally. It's designed to alert you, to inform your choices, not necessarily to stop you in your tracks altogether. The mastery path for working with fear, what some teachers call the ladder of courage, teaches us one absolutely non-negotiable truth. Fear diminishes and often dissolves in action, not in endless thinking, planning, or analysis. This isn't just psychology, it's a neurobiological fact. Your brain, particularly the older, more primitive parts, treats vague, undefined uncertainty, the great unknown what if, as a far greater and more stressful danger than a clear, immediate, definable threat, even if that threat is significant. That's precisely why we spend so much unproductive time mentally catastrophizing about worst-case possibilities that might only have a tiny percentage chance of actually happening. Our minds, as we often joke, can function like incredibly effective horror movie directors, specializing in producing vivid, terrifying mental films about vague, looming catastrophes. You know, the vague sense of impending doom, Part 4, directed entirely inside your own head, playing on repeat. The moment you consciously interrupt that loop and do two things. First, clarify the actual worst-case scenario, which 9 times out of 10, when examined calmly, is completely survivable, maybe messy, maybe difficult, but survivable. And second, take just one small, concrete, manageable step forward in the direction you need to go. You instantly begin to rewrite your neural pathways. That small, seemingly insignificant 1% victory, making the phone call, sending the email, having the first 5 minutes of the difficult conversation, the single minute of presence we talked about earlier transforms the frozen, paralyzing energy of overwhelming fear back into pure, undeniable vitality and forward momentum. It's like turning the lights on in the horror movie. Suddenly the monster seems much less terrifying, maybe even manageable. And the body's physiological relief when you take that step is immediate and palpable. You feel the tension release. Now, alongside fear, we absolutely must look at anger, which is perhaps even more feared and misunderstood in our society. At its core, healthy anger is pure, untainted, vital life energy. It is the innate biological force designed specifically to help you defend your necessary physical and psychological boundaries, and to demand respect for your intrinsic value and needs. We tend to fear anger deeply, often because most of us have only ever witnessed or experienced its degenerate, destructive, and frequently incompetent forms: uncontrolled aggression, hurtful screaming, physical violence, or perhaps its passive-aggressive shadow cousin like sulking, sarcasm, or giving the silent treatment. But true, healthy anger, when accessed consciously, isn't about destruction. It's about pure clarity, focused energy, and hot determination to protect what is important or restore balance. The physiological and psychological cost of chronically repressing this powerful energy is severe. Repressed anger doesn't just magically disappear from your system, it transforms internally, often curdling into resentment. And resentment is a cold, poisonous, corrosive emotional state that slowly, insidiously eats away at you from within. Resentment is chemically toxic. It keeps the body bathed in low-grade stress hormones, contributes significantly to chronic inflammation, fuels autoimmune issues, and leads to what some clinicians aptly describe as a carcinogenic mind, a state of being where you feel chronically unable to voice your needs or utter the simple, potentially life-saving word no when appropriate. The crucial, almost alchemical shift required here involves learning to transform that potentially destructive internalized energy of anger into conscious, constructive action and clear, firm, nonviolent boundary setting. Anger's true, healthy message is always delivered first as a sensation in the body, often heat or tension, and it implicitly asks a question. What essential boundary of mine has just been violated? What core value that I hold dear has just been betrayed or disrespected either by someone else or by myself? When you learn to pause, listen to that signal, identify the message, and then honor it appropriately, perhaps by setting a clear verbal limit — I'm not available to discuss this right now — by physically leaving a toxic situation, by speaking your truth directly but without malice. When you do X, I feel Y, or by demanding fair treatment in a work or personal context, the intense energy of the anger typically settles. It completes its physiological cycle. It shifts from being potentially destructive, if held in or acted out unconsciously, into becoming a highly productive, purposeful energy that fuels forward motion, self-respect, and relational integrity. The underlying key to working skillfully with both fear and anger, and indeed all strong emotions, is recognizing and respecting the essential, uninterruptible flow of emotion through the body. True emotional mastery is not about building bigger psychological dams to control, stop, or suppress your feelings. That's just repression, which we know leads to trouble. Instead, it's about consciously building clear, intentional, healthy channels within yourself to allow these energies to flow naturally and complete their necessary biological cycle without causing harm to yourself or others. Each core emotion has a purpose. Fury wants to establish and defend important limits. Sadness wants to cleanse, empty, and help you metabolize loss. Fear wants to protect you and alert you to potential danger. When you consistently block these natural flows, the energy inevitably solidifies, gets stuck, manifesting instantly as physical tension in the body, contributing to chronic illness over time, and leading to psychological rigidity and defensiveness. It literally cements the mind-body split further. So, our primary work isn't to control the emotions, but simply to get out of their way internally, create safe passage for them, serving its evolutionary purpose before naturally dissipating.
Absolutely. And that capacity you described, that skill of allowing the flow, particularly those hotter emotions like fear and anger, is tested perhaps most profoundly when we encounter the deeper, often quieter, more vulnerable emotions like genuine sadness and pervasive shame. Because working with these requires a depth of vulnerability, a slowing down, and critically, often requires significant time and patience qualities that our fast-paced, productivity-obsessed, and happiness-fixated culture tends to reject or devalue. Let's first address sadness, not as the problem to be fixed, but perhaps as the wise professor of loss. Genuine sadness is not just about feeling bad, complaining, or wallowing in misery indefinitely. It is a necessary, biologically driven metabolic process specifically designed for the healthy integration and acceptance of change, disappointment, and deep loss. Physiologically, the onset of genuine sadness initiates a process that naturally slows the body down. Your energy levels might drop. You might feel the urge to withdraw. This isn't necessarily depression yet, it's biology at work. This slowing down creates an internal, quiet laboratory, if you will, a necessary pause from the external hustle, specifically designed for the careful processing, feeling, and metabolizing of emotional pain. If you consistently avoid this natural process, if you try to stay strong and rush past your grief or numb it prematurely, you are essentially denying your body the essential time and space it needs to heal the somatic archives related to that loss. Unprocessed sadness doesn't simply disappear just because you stop crying or put on a brave face. It deposits itself internally, layer by layer, often manifesting months or even years later as clinical depression. Depression, viewed through this somatic lens, can often be understood as the body's ultimate emergency brake. It's a powerful, undeniable signal, often an ultimatum from your deeper wisdom. Stop. You absolutely must stop this pace. If you don't change something fundamental, this draining environment, this toxic relationship pattern, the fundamentally harsh way you treat yourself, I will have no choice but to shut down the whole system to force a complete halt, because continuing this way is unsustainable. Depression, in this sense, isn't always the end of the road. Sometimes it's the body's last-ditch effort to signal that you have prioritized nonstop functioning over honest feeling for far, far too long. The hidden transformative power of allowing sadness lies in the clear, sometimes painful mirror it holds up to your life. When you allow yourself to truly feel the sadness associated with a loss, maybe a failed venture, a dysfunctional relationship that ended, or a career path that turned out to be soul-crushing, it forces you to look honestly at the precise points where you might have betrayed yourself along the way. Where did you say yes when every cell in your body was screaming no? Where did you abandon your own needs to please someone else? To be able to cry clean, honest tears that acknowledge the reality of the loss and the love that preceded it, is arguably the highest form of biological and emotional intelligence. It is empirical somatic proof that you have loved, invested, and therefore lost, deeply enough to warrant this necessary cleansing process of grief. Then we come to shame. Shame is arguably the most powerful, the most potentially destructive if left unconscious, and yet, paradoxically, the most profoundly transformative of all human emotions when worked with consciously. Shame acts like a powerful mirror of consciousness itself, forcing you to confront the often agonizing gap between who you publicly pretend to be, the image you project, and who you actually fear you might be deep down in private. To navigate this complex territory, we must clearly differentiate between its three distinct phases or forms. First, and most damaging, is toxic shame. This is the pervasive identity-level shame. It's the destructive internal voice or core belief that attacks your fundamental being, asserting not just, I did something wrong, but I am wrong. I am fundamentally flawed. I am inherently bad or irreparable. This deep-seated toxic shame is the primary engine driving most chronic self-sabotage, patterns of internalized abuse, eating disorders, and relentless punishing perfectionism. It feels like a stain on the soul. Second, there is manipulative shame. This is primarily a social control mechanism. It's the voice constantly worried about external perception, judgment, and belonging. What will other people think of me if I do this? Am I making a complete fool of myself in front of my peers? Will they reject me if they see this part of me? This form of shame, while less corrosive than toxic shame, still pushes us into soul-crushing conformity, hiding our authentic essence, and playing small to avoid potential criticism or exclusion. Finally, and crucially for growth, there is transformative shame. This is the sacred, necessary, albeit often painful emotion that arises when our actions genuinely misalign with our own deeply held values or ethical principles. It's the feeling that says, wow, I did wrong in that situation. I acted outside of my integrity. I caused harm, and I can learn from this and choose to do better next time. This is the only form of shame that serves as a gateway to moral integrity, genuine self-improvement, and repairing relational ruptures. The profound insight, particularly from trauma work in Brené Brown's research, is that toxic and manipulative shame thrive absolutely in silence, secrecy, and darkness. They are rooted in the deep, fundamental, primal fear of being seen as unworthy of love and belonging. Therefore, healing from these forms of shame begins the moment that shame is brought gently, carefully, and courageously into the light, ideally through radical vulnerability, shared within a safe, non-judgmental, empathetic connection with another person or group. When shame is met with empathy, it begins to transform. It shifts from being a weapon used against our own identity into becoming a reliable compass, guiding us towards living with greater integrity, authenticity, and self-compassion. It's also important to recognize that consistently fleeing from the feeling of shame is precisely what drives the creation of rigid, defensive personality shields or adaptations. Narcissism, for example, can be understood as a complex shield designed to avoid ever being seen as imperfect, needy, or vulnerable. Cynicism often acts as a preemptive shield, rejecting the world and its messy people before they have a chance to reject you. Extreme perfectionism, as we've touched on, functions as an exhausting shield attempting to be so flawless, so beyond reproach, that no critic, whether internal or external, can possibly find a single point of attack. All of these highly defended, often high-performing, yet ultimately rigid and isolating adaptations are, at their core, brilliant but now obsolete strategies developed, often unconsciously, to avoid ever feeling the searing pain of perceived inadequacy or unworthiness associated with shame. Ultimately, the goal of this entire challenging yet rewarding journey back into the body, through the layers of emotion, is integration. It's moving towards a state perhaps best articulated in frameworks like Ken Wilber's integral model, envisioning a state where the four core dimensions of our human being can learn to coexist in a dynamic, flowing harmony. The first dimension is the body. recognizing it not just as a machine, but as the sacred temple, the living terrain, the only physical vessel where our soul, our consciousness takes flesh in this life. It must be honored, listened to deeply, and felt fully. The second is the mind. Acknowledging the mind as a magnificent, powerful instrument, a complex biocomputer capable of incredible feats, but one that must be consciously recalibrated to serve the wisdom of the body and the guidance of the spirit, rather than blindly dominating them based on fear or past conditioning. The mind must be directed wisely, not obeyed automatically. The third dimension is the shadow. This encompasses all the unintegrated, often disowned energy within us, the envy, the rage, the lust, the greed, the laziness, all the parts we've deemed unacceptable or not me, based on societal or familial conditioning. This potent shadow energy must be gradually accepted, welcomed back with curiosity, and understood compassionately, not judged or eliminated. Because acceptance is what transforms this raw, often volatile power into harnessed wisdom, creativity, and vitality. And the fourth dimension is the spirit. This represents our innate sense of profound purpose, intrinsic connection to something larger than our individual ego and meaning. This isn't necessarily found in lofty religious dogma or abstract philosophical concepts out in the clouds, but rather it's discovered most powerfully in the radical acceptance of the present moment, right here, right now, often accessed most directly through the simple, conscious act of the breath itself. When these four fundamental parts, body, mind, shadow, and spirit, begin to align, communicate, and operate in active dialogue rather than internal conflict, the endless inner war starts to subside. A natural state of flow, ease, and purpose begins to emerge more consistently. Healing, therefore, is fundamentally understood as this ongoing process of integration, of bringing all the fragmented pieces back into relationship with each other. It's not just about intellectually understanding concepts about healing, because, as we discussed right at the beginning, knowledge without genuine embodied integration is simply another highly refined, sometimes very sophisticated avoidance mechanism, a complex intellectual way of staying safely and comfortably up in your head while merely pretending, perhaps even to yourself, that you are already operating from your whole integrated feeling heart. True integration is felt, lived, and breathed.
Taking that powerful integral model now and applying it back to what feels like one of the most pervasive and urgent challenges of our modern time. The global epidemic of addiction in all its forms, the scope and complexity of the problem really expand dramatically beyond just seeing it as an individual failing or a purely biochemical issue. Addiction fundamentally stems from a profound absence, a deep separation from one's authentic self, from genuine reciprocal love, or from meaningful connection to community and purpose becomes an absolutely crucial lens through which to view this crisis. Seen this way, the brain, which is biologically hardwired and starving for the healthy neurochemical rewards like dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, it should have received abundantly from secure attachment, reciprocal human bonds, creative expression, and a clear sense of purpose, inevitably seeks out the quickest, most immediate, and most potent chemical or behavioral substitute available in the environment to fill that aching void. This fundamental deficiency, this deep internal ache of disconnection, directly fuels the vicious cycle of avoidance that traps millions of people worldwide. It often starts subtly. When a person feels underlying pain, maybe from past trauma, current stress, emotional neglect, loneliness, or paralyzing fear, their instinctive, often unconscious coping mechanism is to disassociate, to mentally check out. They move out of their feeling body, away from the discomfort, and retreat into their head for analysis or distraction, or often just drift into a state of vague numbness or restless boredom. That very act of disassociation, of leaving presence, immediately triggers the brain's urgent, primal search for quick relief, for any way to change the current state. This leads directly to seeking out readily available substitutes. Maybe reaching for sugary foods, compulsively scrolling through social media feeds, making an impulsive online purchase, pouring a drink, using a drug, or even diving relentlessly into overwork as a way to numb out and feel productive. That momentary hit of comfort, numbness, or distraction provided by the substance or behavior is inevitably short-lived. It soon gives way to feelings of shame, guilt, self-recrimination, and often an intensification of the original underlying pain, which has only been temporarily masked, not resolved. This, of course, only strengthens the profound perceived need for more relief, creating a powerful, self-destructive feedback loop. The brain, heavily driven by the survival-oriented limbic system, is ruthlessly programmed to take the quickest, easiest path to perceived comfort or reward, even when that path consistently costs us our long-term happiness, our physical health, our relationships, and our fundamental self-worth. But critically, in today's world, we absolutely must widen the lens of what we commonly call addiction, far beyond just the traditional substance use disorders involving drugs and alcohol. We are undeniably living through a rapidly escalating epidemic of behavioral dependencies, and understanding this requires us to cast a direct, critical eye on certain aspects of modern commerce, sometimes referred to by critics as limbic capitalism. This term refers specifically to how entire massive sectors of modern business, ranging from the tech industry, social media, gaming, to food manufacturing, highly processed foods engineered for hyperpalatability, to gambling and even aspects of the financial markets, are expertly intentionally designed to profit directly from creating and sustaining addictive patterns of behavior in consumers. They capitalize directly on hijacking our brain's ancient reward pathways, bypassing our rational frontal cortex entirely through sophisticated psychological manipulation and intermittent reward schedules. Think about some of the specific pervasive dependencies that characterize the digital age. Take online gaming, for example. For many, it's a harmless pastime, but for a significant and growing number, it can become profoundly compulsive, often hiding a dark secret of severe neglect of real-life relationships suffer, work or school performance plummets, physical health declines. Why does this happen? Because the psychological reward system is built into many modern games. The constant leveling up, the unpredictable loot drops, the instant visual and auditory feedback, the powerful social validation within the game world are engineered with the same precision as a Las Vegas slot machine, specifically to keep the brain's limbic system perpetually engaged and craving the next hit. This principle is known as intermittent variable reinforcement, and neurochemically, it is exponentially more addictive than receiving a predictable reward, deliberately exploiting the brain's powerful need to just check one more time, just in case this time brings the big payoff. Then there is the ubiquitous presence of social media, the platform that actively fuels the dangerous live or die for likes dynamic we see everywhere. Here, the fundamental human need for connection and validation becomes twisted into a full-blown, often anxiety-ridden behavioral addiction for millions. The like button, the notification alert, the endless scroll, these function as perfectly delivered microdoses of dopamine, administered on a completely variable schedule that keeps us checking our devices compulsively hundreds of times a day. This addiction is sustained not just by the intermittent rewards, but crucially by tapping into and amplifying the deep underlying fear of disconnection, the fear of missing out, FOMO, and the pervasive feeling of being worthless or invisible if not constantly validated externally, which, as we discussed, is rooted in shame. These platforms are arguably designed, consciously or unconsciously, to keep us chronically anxious, externally referenced, comparing ourselves unfavorably to curated illusions, and completely absent from our own physical, embodied, authentic reality in the present moment. The body's silent, desperate cry within all these diverse addictions, whether they are primarily chemical or behavioral, remains universally the same underneath the surface manifestation. The compulsion, whatever form it takes, can be understood as a profoundly misdirected attempt at healing. It's a desperate, tragically substituted search for the lost peace, the lost connection, the lost vitality, the lost ecstasy of the integrated soul. The true, deep detoxification process, the real beginning of the challenging work of recovery and integration, starts not necessarily on the day you physically throw away the bottle, delete the app, or flush the drugs. Those are important steps, certainly. But the deeper shift begins internally, in the moment you make the conscious, courageous declaration to your own embattled nervous system. Okay, I stop running now. I give myself permission, maybe just for this moment, maybe just for this breath, to finally turn towards and feel what I've been trying so desperately hard for so long to forget, to numb, or to escape. That turning towards, rather than away from, the inner reality is the pivotal moment.
That pivotal moment you just described, that conscious decision to finally move from the perceived safety of avoidance and numbness into the raw vulnerability of feeling, marks the fundamental energetic shift. It's the beginning of the transformation, from unconsciously living as a victim of circumstances and past wounds, towards consciously choosing the path of the warrior. Embarking on this path requires a radical internal shift in identity, perspective, and critically, a willingness to compassionately acknowledge and work with the legacy of the deepest wounds that built the initial defensive structures in the first place. We have to finally confront the legacy of trauma that likely necessitated the creation of these elaborate defense mechanisms long ago. The groundbreaking study provided empirical, large-scale evidence for what psychologists and physicians working with trauma had observed clinically for decades. Namely, that a high score resulting from cumulative exposure during childhood to experiences like physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, or significant household dysfunction, like parental separation, substance abuse, mental illness, or incarceration, has profound, long-lasting impacts on adult health and life trajectory. Essentially, a high score often means that your developing nervous system, in order to survive those challenging or threatening conditions, created an elaborate suit of physiological and psychological armor. This armor typically involves patterns of hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threat, emotional numbing or dissociation, and chronic muscle tension. That armor was absolutely brilliant. It was an intelligent adaptation that likely saved you as a child. It kept you alert, helped you predict danger, and allowed you to keep functioning somehow in an unpredictable, unsafe, or non-nurturing world. But now, as an adult living in potentially very different circumstances, that same suit of armor, which is often still running automatically in the background of your nervous system, severely limits you. It restricts your ability to connect authentically, to feel fully alive, to trust others, and to rest deeply. And physiologically, it manifests over time as chronic physical disease, like cardiovascular problems, autoimmune conditions, debilitating anxiety disorders, persistent depression, complex PTSD, or that state of complete physical and emotional depletion we call burnout. This happens because the nervous system remains perpetually stuck in the fight, flight, or freeze mode, constantly anticipating a danger that is usually no longer present externally, but remains deeply archived and active within the body's memory. This underlying armor, this set of survival adaptations formed in response to specific early wounds, dictates many of our ingrained adult personality patterns and relational dynamics. These patterns must be recognized not as character flaws, but for what they truly are. Once brilliant survival strategies that are now completely obsolete and are actively, though unintentionally, sabotaging the very adult lives, relationships, and sense of fulfillment we deeply desire. For instance, if your primary childhood wound involved experiences of abandonment, perhaps through parental loss, divorce, neglect, or emotional unavailability, creating a deep fear of being left alone and helpless, you likely develop patterns of anxious attachment in adult relationships. This might manifest as clinginess, jealousy, difficulty spending time alone, and subsequent codependency, where you overly rely on relationships for your sense of safety and worth, constantly fearing loss. Alternatively, if you experienced chronic rejection in childhood, perhaps feeling criticized, unwanted, or that your authentic self was fundamentally unacceptable to your caregivers, you likely adapted by developing patterns of hyper-independence and emotional detachment. You might have unconsciously decided, I don't need anyone, I can rely only on myself, as a way to protect yourself from the unbearable pain of anticipated rejection. This creates a highly functional, often successful, but ultimately lonely and isolated adult life where deep intimacy feels threatening. Or, if you grew up in an environment characterized by chronic humiliation, shaming, or relentless, crushing criticism, you likely internalized that pattern and became driven by a harsh, punishing inner critic. This often manifests as intense self-criticism, constant comparison to others, and always falling short, difficulty accepting compliments or celebrating successes, and a deep-seated feeling of never being quite good enough, regardless of external achievements. The critical realization for the emerging warrior within is this: these deeply ingrained, often painful patterns are not evidence of you being fundamentally flawed or broken. They are scars. They are living maps of the survival strategies you intelligently learned when you were small, vulnerable, and utterly powerless to change your environment. And now, recognizing that the map is outdated, that the territory of your adult life is different, becomes the first courageous act. Choosing consciously to begin dismantling that old armor, piece by painful piece, with compassion and support, is the warrior's work. This internal healing process, this dismantling of old armor, is profoundly and directly connected to the possibility of generational change, particularly through the practice of conscious parenting. It's a well-established principle in developmental psychology that children do not primarily internalize our explicit words, lectures, or advice. Instead, they absorb our underlying energetic state, the unspoken truth being constantly communicated by our nervous system, our posture, our tone of voice, our presence, or lack thereof. When a parent is operating primarily from their own state of internal disconnection, chronic tension, pervasive anxiety, or is still unconsciously running on the unhealed armor from their own high-score childhood, the child's developing nervous system automatically, through processes like neuroception, learns to mirror that state. The child learns implicitly that the world is unsafe, that connection is unreliable, that they must be hyper-vigilant, or that their own needs are secondary. Thus, the parent's unresolved trauma is often passed down energetically to the next generation. The only truly effective way to break this painful generational legacy is for the adult, the parent, to commit consciously and diligently to healing their own inner child first, to tend to their own historical wounds, to regulate their own nervous system, to dismantle their own obsolete armor. As the parent does this work, They transform their old, volatile wounds into stable wisdom, increased patience, genuine presence, and authentic kindness, not just for their child, but first and foremost for themselves. Conscious parenting, therefore, never really starts with focusing on fixing the child's behavior. It always starts with the parent's unwavering commitment to their own self-awareness, emotional regulation, and ongoing self-integration. Finally, embarking on this challenging journey back into the body, back towards wholeness and integration, inevitably redefines our fundamental sense of purpose in the world, our vocation. Vocation, in its deepest sense, is far more profound than just a career choice, a job title, or an economic hustle to pay the bills. It represents the natural, emergent direction through which life itself, your unique soul essence, wants to express itself creatively and contribute meaningfully through you. However, unresolved trauma, pervasive fear, especially fear of failure or judgment, and the deeply ingrained need for external validation often make us choose the false comfort and predictability of security over the terrifying uncertainty and vulnerability of following our true calling. We choose the safe, socially approved, often predictable path, even if it feels soul-crushing, rather than risk stepping onto the path that genuinely excites us but feels unknown. This misalignment is a primary driver of the widespread phenomena of burnout, midlife crises, and quiet despair. The only reliable path to discovering and embodying your true work, your deepest purpose, the thing that makes you feel authentically alive, is to learn how to consistently quiet the deafening, frantic, often fear-based noise in your head. You must cultivate the capacity to listen closely, patiently, to the subtle yet undeniable truth continuously being spoken by your integrated body-mind system. Your body knows on a cellular level exactly what it came here to do, what makes it feel energized, and where it can make its most meaningful contribution. We just need to learn to listen to its guidance. Ultimately, as we navigate this path of healing and integration, we face a final, profound choice, presented to us perhaps moment by moment, certainly day by day. We can continue, often unconsciously, to walk the path of the victim. This path is characterized by experiencing suffering without finding meaning in it, by feeling powerless, by blaming external circumstances or others, and by constantly seeking rapid chemical or behavioral relief simply to stay numb and comfortable, avoiding the deeper work. Or we can consciously choose to walk the path of the warrior. This path doesn't deny suffering. Suffering is an inevitable part of life, but it means actively choosing courage over comfort when necessary. It involves allowing the inevitable pain and challenges of life to serve as catalysts for growth, wisdom, increased compassion, and profound transformation. It's about taking responsibility for our inner state and our choices, regardless of external circumstances. The simple, yet incredibly difficult truth, the ultimate distillation of this entire deep dive, is that lasting healing and true transformation are not primarily achieved by endlessly analyzing the past, nor by attempting to rigidly control or perfectly plan the future. Both are mind-based strategies that keep us out of the present. Instead, healing happens, integration deepens, by cultivating the capacity to remain fully, radically, and honestly present with whatever's arising within the body, within the feeling state, right here, right now. The true revolution, the final ongoing transformation, happens not in grasping a new concept or attending another lecture, but in the slow, conscious, patient, and continuous act of returning to the breath again and again. That is the ground of being.
That brings us towards the end of this really deep exploration, and it feels right to circle back one last time to that foundational, simple, yet incredibly profound truth we started with. That your body is the only source of truth you possess that never, ever lies. We will all, inevitably, at some point in our lives, hit that metaphorical wall, that point where the accumulated weight of unexpressed emotion, unprocessed trauma, or sustained inauthenticity becomes too heavy for the system to bear. It's the point where the body finally says, in no uncertain terms, through its own language, I simply cannot carry this silence, this tension, this disconnection anymore. It might manifest dramatically, perhaps as a serious chronic illness that refuses to resolve despite conventional treatments. It might appear as a debilitating anxiety attack that completely stops you in your tracks, forcing a pause, or it might be a more subtle, creeping exhaustion, a soul weariness that no amount of sleep, vacation, or external stimulation seems to fix. That wall, when we hit it, is not a sign of failure. It's not punishment. It is perhaps the final, loudest, and most necessary invitation home. It's the body's ultimate call for integration, for a return to wholeness, for an end to the internal war. This deep dive has hopefully offered a framework, maybe some useful maps, perhaps even a sense of initiation into this way of understanding ourselves. But the real work begins not with some massive, dramatic, life-altering decision made purely in the head. usually begins much more quietly, with a single, small, consistent act of returning to presence within your own skin. So, perhaps the best way to conclude is to leave you not with an answer, but with the ultimate, most challenging, and potentially most fruitful question posed by this entire exploration. This is something for you to carry forward, not to answer intellectually right now, but to test against the wisdom of your own biology, against the felt sense of your own life, day by day. How much longer do you truly choose to live separated from yourself? The beginning of the way forward, the first step on this path of integration, requires no grand declaration, no public announcement. It starts simply. It starts with a small, consistent act that begins to reclaim your own inner sanctuary from the noise of the world and the chatter of the mind.